before the this is before computers, if you can imagine before computers. Everything was done by hand. When we had to do an ad that said, we're having a dance, and then a photograph or a drawing, we had to take these pieces of plastic that had letters on them. I forgot what the term is, and then scratch off the letter. It took hours to do what the computer does in 10 minutes. And the typesetting all had to be typeset, then printed out, and the columns, we had to put tape on the, glue on the back, and then put it down, and then have the paper, you know, the one page. There were like 12 or 15 pages. I mean, it took a long time to put it all together, so it wasn't, and it came out monthly at the beginning. And we had to have it at the Daily, I forgot what the name of the press was, but it was newsprint. It wasn't like slick gloss material. It was a newspaper, like you read the Baltimore Sun, that kind of newsprint paper.
It's like night and day. The difference is back in the 80s and today. In the 80s, we used X-Acto knives that cut up strips of typeset that was done when it was manually typed in by literally persons who would take an article that was either handwritten or typewritten and convert it into what we call a galley, a typewritten or at least typeset columns. And we used to cut them and put them on big cardboards, boards basically to fit the paper, fit this text on these boards. Put photos involved, and that are involved. Kind of attach them in envelopes, but mark them as what they would do, and they would be glued to these boards, and the boards themselves would be sent to the printer, and that's when they would be printed into a paper. Today, everything is done now by computer. They have programs that actually take the typewritten words and they convert it into typeset, and it's maneuvered strictly by using a mouse and putting it on the paper that way, and inserting photographs the same way. So it's a completely modernized mechanism now in terms of production as it was back 30 years ago. Big difference.
Well, I wasn't involved in the day-to-day production of the paper. That was Mike and Joe's responsibility. I focused on doing that column that I do, the Beltway, and maybe occasionally writing an article, or editorial or something like that. From just being around them, I know that the day-to-day focus was on the business side was Mike trying to make sure that the ad folks were selling enough ads. Joe was deciding on what stories to cover with input from Mike, and then they would be either writing stories or getting writers to write stories, and then pulling it together during the week leading up to the day we printed it. We were originally located in off of Harford Road, out near Northern Parkway, and the staff would go to the office every day, and maybe have a day off after we came out on a Friday. They would maybe not come in that next Monday, but they would focus on preparing for the next issue pretty much as soon as the last issue was done. Mike was a good businessman, so he knew to keep an eye on the revenue and the expenses so that we were, at least breaking even. So that's sort of how I sense what was going on, pretty much on a daily basis.
It was just business as usual. It was always a crisis. We were always out of money. The center was always broke. So whether we had the money to go to the printers, at one point we changed printers because we couldn't pay 3 months in arrears at one printer, and they refused to take the next issue. And so we went to another printer and built up 3 months in arrears at them. And then Pride Day came along and we had enough money to pay off the first one. Almost all the crises were financial. The other major crisis had to do with Harvey Schwartz being terminated. Harvey had been the executive director, the first executive director, the only hired employee of the center for the first couple of years. And he was extraordinarily devoted to the community, and he was very competent in certain things like ad sales. He was not politically sensitive. He offended people right and left. And eventually enough people got offended that they decided that they didn't want him around anymore, and that we needed a more professional organization, and we needed someone who was a better representative of the community when someone had to show up at a news conference or something like that. They wanted somebody who was more polished and more diplomatic than Harvey was. And so eventually there was a showdown and the board terminated him. Many people were very bitter about that decision. Some people left the paper. Jim Becker, I don't know that he left the center, but he became very disillusioned with it for a long time. I had very mixed feelings about it because I understood the objections to Harvey, but I also understood more than most people how valuable he was to the paper and to the center. In subsequent years, Harvey has been rehabilitated. There's a plaque in the center recognizing his contributions, and I'm sure almost anyone you talk to from the early days will say good things about Harvey. But he could be a very difficult person to work with. And that was a crisis, and that did have an impact on the newspaper, not only because of the advertising, but because some of the people involved in the paper felt like they were in the Harvey camp rather than the other camp.
Most of us had jobs at the time. This was a volunteer thing that we would just do after work or on weekends. During the monthly production, it wasn't such a big pressing time deadline situation. We knew when we had to do this. I don't recall the number of days before we go to press we did it, but usually it was the final week before we had to do that. And we'd come in at night and do the things we needed to do. A few of us who were volunteered and part of this process would do that. And it would take just a few hours a night for about 4 nights or so to do it. Again, today it's a different process completely. And it's so automated now that you don't need to have people doing that. But putting the paper together today, for at least for Baltimore Out Loud, it's usually a 3-day operation where the articles are taken, converted into its usable format, and then laid out in the paper. Then proofs go out and checking and see if there's any maneuvering and changing positioning and so on and so forth. That's just basically a three-day process, but not an all-day thing now.
Oh, well, all the blanks having to do with gays and lesbians, it filled in. Because, as I say, there was nothing in the mainstream media at that time. And that included, it really was everything. The gay cultural events, gay bar events, the health issues when they came up. Of course, eventually that became front page news in all the major media when the AIDS epidemic finally hit. But there were a number of it was, I don't know if it's months or years, the time period between the appearance of gay cancer, they used to call it, and the recognition of AIDS as such. In that period, all the medical information that people got in Baltimore came from the gay paper, and then the alternative, which was in fact mostly devoted to what was going on with the AIDS epidemic. But one could not expect to get decent health information from the other media in those days.
The mainstream press, more today than ever, are covering LGBT issues. Before it was not a popular thing. It was sort of the LGBT community was marginalized, was considered a fringe group, a minority in itself, that wasn't really taken well by the mainstream press. They would not cover our stories too well. They didn't get involved. They also weren't sensitive to language at the time. They were making, they would use terms that maybe not intentionally being insensitive, but they would say them. They just weren't clued into to really what's proper verbiage when they cover it. So that they have improved over time. They've gotten to know more LGBT people as the papers have grown. They've gotten to be more aware of our issues and of covering them far more in depth than they used to be. The function of the LGBT press is to still cover stories from our perspective, not from the mainstream perspective, and probably get into a little deeper in some of the areas that they may be covering, but we cover a little bit more and better perhaps.
The almost sole audience consisted of the gay community, such as it was, and most of that came through people going to bars. That was, at that time, the main way people connected. I mean, there wasn't Facebook in those days. You wanted to meet a gay person, you had to go to a gay bar, and there were stacks of papers, and that was the community that we served. And like I say, we mailed out papers to a number of other people, but I don't think we got much response from that.
The paper has been distributed to schools, to colleges, I should say, not the schools, but universities, colleges around the area, to markets, bookstores, coffee shops. So anybody has access to it. They weren't necessarily marketed to a particular thing. I mean, we would consider the LGBT community to be our core readership, because they would find our thing most interested. But now we're finding, as kids are coming out at an early age, perhaps their parents might see a newspaper that's LGBT oriented to take a look and see what the child might be all about. So and you also have a lot more straight allies involved in our causes, that they themselves may not be gay. They may have a neighbor that is, or LGBT, or a coworker, friend, relative, and they may pick up the paper. So I think the market has expanded from just the narrowest form of being just the LGBT community. I think it is available to the public. It's not only available in LGBT venues. So it is out there, and we do put them out in libraries here too as well. So anybody can pick them up, and anybody can see it. So to say, it's really hard to say what our true market is. I think it's everybody who might be interested in issues relating to the LGBT community, but I don't think I know it's not restricted just to the LGBT world.